More than education, training, and experience, a person's level of resiliency is what often determines who succeeds and who fails. The inter-office dynamics at work is an ongoing challenge, and employees and managers are feeling the pain. Whether you own a family business or work for a Fortune 500 company, resiliency is truly the X factor. So take a coffee break and come join us for another edition of the Resiliency X Factor, or as we like to simply call it, RX, your prescription for success in business. So welcome to another edition of the Resiliency X Factor, or as we simply call it, RX, your prescription for success in business. So we're excited for this podcast as we talk about resiliency from yet a different lens. In our previous podcasts, we've spent a lot of time talking about resiliency as it relates to the personal individual within work and their ability to be resilient in a go-forward basis. Now I think it's time for us to take a much deeper dive into what are the roles and the skills of a leader, how impactful it is for a leader to be resilient and how that contributes to their success within an organization in their role. So the transition to becoming a supervisor or manager, Dr. Keith, as you and I know, can oftentimes be very difficult. Those technical skills that oftentimes get you hired initially are the things that can ultimately get you in the way from being that high-achieving leader overall. Leadership skills, as we're aware, are complex, and they require a multitude of different skills and techniques and understanding of human behavior. So, Dr. Keith, with that in mind, how is it that most leaders truly become leaders?
Well, there's several ways, Matt. Three very common ways is, first of all, like you said, that they're technical skills. They're good at what they do, what I call good doers. Also, another one is seniority. Matt, you've been here for 25 years. Let's make you the leader. And the last one that people don't talk about but still exists is the who you know in the organization that moves you to the top.
I think those are three fair areas. You cannot underestimate the ability of being well networked, and oftentimes seniority does play a role in the individuals that will get promoted within an organization. But this good doer concept, I actually think in my experience in organizations, that oftentimes is where individuals struggle making that leap from individual contributor to leader. So let's explore that a little bit further. When you say good doer, what does that actually mean?
Well, it goes back to something you said at the beginning of the podcast. The technical skills, I'm just calling it technical skills that a person comes to work with, that's how they got hired. That's because they're good at what they do. And so because you're so good at what you do, let's make you the leader. But what we know and what you understand is that the skills associated with your technical side is very different from leadership skills. It's a totally different skill set. And consequently, we have people thrown into leadership positions without the proper training, education, and understanding of what it takes to become a leader.
And I would imagine that once you start to really think about the psychology of it all as well, you start to realize that oftentimes individuals get their self-worth and their value from the things that they're accomplishing, they're checking off the list. So when you've gotten promoted because you've accomplished a lot of things and you've shown a lot of results from the things that you're doing, your natural inclination once you're in that new leadership role is got to still show the things that I'm doing, and you lose sight of some of the intangibles, which are all built around leadership, which oftentimes aren't necessarily as easily visible, but all the more critical to success.
Right, and let me add to that. And not only is that's what they want to do because they're good at it, but that's what they gravitate back to. That's their default. And consequently, as we know, Psychology 101, we gravitate to the things we like and we avoid the things we don't like. And so what happens is that many leaders lack some of these skills when they first become a leader. And so what do? They go back to all the doing things. And if they're doing, then they're not leading.
So when you think about leadership, then you realize that you have kind of a multiple set of different dimensions or different leadership styles. So even if you successfully make that transition to being a good doer into a good leader, you have to recognize those leaders may have different styles unto themselves.
You bet. And there's basically today, you pick up a leadership book and everybody's talking about a different leadership style. We captured about 6 of them, that basic 6 styles of leadership.
So before we dive into each one, 50,000 foot, hit us with each of those 6.
It's the 6. The first one is what we call the authoritative leader. And not to be confused with the autocratic leader. There's a coaching leader, there's the affiliative, democratic, pace-setting, and the coercive.
All right, so let's take those first 3. So when we look at authoritative, coaching, affiliative, break down each of those for us.
Well, the authoritative leader is one that I believe that is one of the most effective. These are your visionary leaders. They allow people to innovate, experiment, and take calculated risks.
All right. The coaching leader?
Well, this unfortunately is one that's not used as much as it should be. These are people who develop people for the future. They're good at identifying their strengths and weaknesses and really developing that individual.
Really requires a lot of time to be able to invest in the individual, as well as thinking about their success and their ability to be able to do more things than they're currently doing themselves.
Absolutely, yep.
The affiliative, tell us about that.
This works really well in conjunction with the authoritative style. These are the leaders who create that emotional bond and harmony in the team, master creating that team feeling and a real sense of belonging.
Okay, and the democratic?
Democratic is good when you're unsure of the direction you're going to and you want to really generate some good ideas. They build consensus through participation, drives flexibility, responsibility, a commitment.
I could see, though, where that could be a challenge sometimes, and individuals who take on that democratic approach may oftentimes be viewed as not necessarily leading in what we view as the traditional sense.
Yeah, and this brings up a really good point that when you look at a leadership style, it's not one. Our research shows that people use many styles throughout the day, throughout the week, month. Almost the analogy is like having a bag of a golf club. And for each, as we know, if you're a golfer, each hole, each position, where you are on the fairway or not the fairway, you use a different club. Same thing with leadership style, depending on the situation. So it's not just one way fits all.
So as we talk about each of these 6, recognize the fact that you may choose to utilize any one of these styles at a different point in time in any given week, month, or year of your own leadership style. All right, so we hit the first 4. Let's talk about pace setting and coercive with regard to leadership styles.
Yeah, the pace setting, these are the 2 that you got to be very, very careful, especially the pace setting individual. This should be used sparingly. This is a time during a crisis, but unfortunately there are leaders who do this all the time, and it's faster, quicker. We got to get it done. It's all about outcome. We got to go. And what happens is that it really destroys morale. And the last one, that coercive leader, I got to tell you, Matt, I don't find that necessary in the workplace. In life, is something that unfortunately is still applied in the workplace. In my mind, it's the least effective. It's that top-down telling people what to do and how to do it. To me, I don't think there's a place for it.
All right. So, Keith, I want to go back a little bit, too, because I thought it was a great analogy, thinking about those leadership styles with regard to kind of a set of golf clubs. And I know my golf game, and I also know my handicap. And the one thing I always rely on, because I'm not a great golfer, is that's that trusty 3-wood. So whenever I have to try to rely on a great shot, out comes the trusty 3-wood. To build off of that, I oftentimes will recognize that leaders will gravitate probably more towards one style than another, using one club, if you will. So when you start to break that down, tell us more. Would you agree that they tend to grab one club as opposed to, as you had suggested, looking to be more versatile?
Yeah, it's what I said earlier, that we, Psychology 101, we gravitate to what we feel comfortable with, what we like, and we avoid the others. So yes, we tend to, and that is one of the major reasons that I believe blocks get in the way of leaders being highly effective. There's many factors.
So let's dig a little deeper then. What are some of those reasons that are hindering managers from really being the best that they can be? Well,
as we talked about in past podcasts, our communication styles, our poor communication skills, people who don't listen or don't ask the open-ended questions, etc. How about leaders with, I call it a weak ego? Their ego gets in the way, or we all have blind spots. It could be our blind spots, and certainly, as we talked about in one of our other podcasts, leaders with low social and emotional intelligence, all could get in the way.
So fair enough. And certainly we have recognized that part of being a successful leader is being resilient. That's not just for the individuals, but leaders need to be resilient as well. So when we come back after our break, I'd like to explore a little bit more in depth in identifying some critical skills that are required to making sure that the leaders that are listening to our podcast now truly can become high-performing leaders and know how to pick out more than just that trusty 3-wood. We'll catch you right after the break. So welcome back. Now, before our break, we had discussed what were some of the key points of being a resilient leader. Now, Dr. Keith, I want to begin turning our attention to what are some of those critical skills that are required to truly being that high-performing, resilient leader as well. So, Dr. Keith, I know there's several critical skills that we talk about for highly effective leaders. I'm going to put you on the spot right now. If you had to select just one mission-critical skill, what would it be?
You know, man, let me respond with a question.
You don't seem too thrown off by my just one critical skill.
Because I was anticipating it. So let me, knowing, Matt, that leadership is all about building relationships. We talked about that before. We say it often. What would you say is the basic foundation a relationship is built upon? You know, the basic cement and mortar of our relationships.
You should be an attorney. I ask you a tough question, and you answer the question by coming back with a tough question to me. So here we go. Rephrase it. You threw me off there while I was on the stand.
No, okay, so what do you suppose? Leadership is all about relationships. Relationships are built on what? What's the basic foundation of all relationships? Work, home, doesn't matter.
To me, it's a no-brainer. I say it's built on trust.
You bet. Absolutely. And without trust, a relationship is built on, a shaky foundation, which could crumble at any time based on the work stress, the frustrations, the pressures at work. And that's the problem.
Yeah, the metaphor that you state just by the foundation, and without trust being truly that strongly poured foundation, things can break down and crumble. In the workplace, I see it all the time. I see managers and employees, and the breakdown of that dynamic oftentimes just comes from the very simple thing like trust, where you have managers that will use the language of setting the tone of wanting to empower their employees, give them that autonomy, that responsibility to make the mark on their own, and then that employee proudly creates a work product, turns that in, and what does the manager do? Well, just kind of offline behind the scenes. Not that they're not allowed to review it. Certainly they're the leader, but they review it, they make changes, and oftentimes they won't even share with the employee why they did it. And so what does that do? That just builds and festers and creates this dynamic of, does my manager really trust the work that I did? They went around and made some changes and didn't even bother to let me know about it. You do that once, twice, 3 times, back to that analogy, cracks, crumbles in that foundation before it breaks down.
And this is the same leader who says, I have an open door policy, and I hear it a lot. My response is, are they coming in?
Yeah.
And if they're not coming in, what does that tell you?
That alone starts to send those messages of really, where is that trust? Where is that working relationship?
You bet.
So let's kind of build from there. And that in itself certainly makes sense. But as we oftentimes do, let's look at the behaviors behind the words that we'll oftentimes talk about. So when we talk about trustworthiness, help our listeners better understand what are the behaviors, what are the things that they should be seeing that they recognize that this is truly a trusted relationship or there's cracks in the foundation.
Well, good question, Matt. And again, it's incumbent upon the leader to take the first step in the relationship. Because as I said, oftentimes, is that as a leader, you're always being watched. Your folks are always watching you. Everything you say and don't say, everything you do and don't do, your folks are watching you. So it's incredible. It's critical that you demonstrate as a leader, you demonstrate what I call rich, trusting behaviors. And rich is an acronym. Very simple acronym that stands for reliable, intimacy or integrity, credible, and humble.
All right, so let's break each of those down. Anytime you're talking about moolah, cash money, it's got my attention. But in this case, we're talking about rich in order to build a rich, trusted relationship. So the first line there was reliable. Talk a little more about reliable.
Are you reliable? Do you do what you say you're going to do? Can I count on you? That's being reliable, just as everybody can think. Because if you're not, guess what? I don't trust you then.
And Dr. Keith, is that just from the lens when we're talking about rich from the leader demonstrating these, or are we talking about it on the employee side, or both? Let's get some clarification before we dive into the rest of the acronym.
Well, it's a good question, and I'm coming from at this moment what the leader can do to demonstrate trustworthy behaviors.
All right. So the first thing they need to do as a leader driving trust is make sure that they are truly being viewed as a reliable leader to their employees. Right. Kind of servant leadership, if you will. The next is intimacy. Now, as an HR professional, you have my attention. I'm like, I don't know if we want to incorporate that into the manager-employee relationship, but somehow I don't think we mean intimacy the way that I'm thinking about it.
I wouldn't do that to you, Matt. I know the HR professional that you are. So, no, it's not from that lens whatsoever. Basically what we're talking about here is, are you creating an environment where people feel safe, that they can come into your office and sit down and talk to you about everything, anything that's on their mind, knowing that it's confidential and you're going to truly listen to them. It's that intimate environment, if you would. Another, you can change the intimacy, the I there, with integrity, working from integrity for sure.
And I think it's an important piece that you talk about, because oftentimes employees will look for their manager/leader to open up and allow that employee to feel comfortable sharing the things that are on their mind. And it isn't necessarily that the leader then takes that information and is in a gossip fashion sharing it with others. Sometimes that can break down because the leader has taken that information and a week, a month later, almost uses it against them. So I've heard situations, I've heard situations where, and seen situations where an employee comes in and they'll share that they're having some challenges at home in difficulty with regard to managing schedules with regard to the kids. And, they just want them to be aware of that, and they'll do their best to come in on time. And sure enough, 3 weeks later, without incident, the manager kind of dangles that out in front of them and almost makes them feel guilty or poor in feeling about a situation that may have only presented itself one time.
Yep. Good point. Very good point.
So we got reliable, we have intimacy/integrity. Let's talk about credibility and humble.
Credibility is pretty simple. Do you walk the talk? Do you do what you say you're going to do? If you're saying, hey, we don't talk behind one another's back, and then you turn to me and say, hey, did you hear about Barb? Blah, 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 blah. No, you're not being credible. They don't trust that.
Okay, and then final, humble.
Humble is new. This is based on some new research and looking at CEOs. And one of the top behaviors or characteristics that make a great CEO, and some of the research that we've been looking at, is that they're humble. They're more other-centric as opposed to being self-centric. So when they talk about the organization, they talk about the team, it's we instead of I. And so humbleness is critical skill.
All right, so a great walkthrough of Rich being reliable, intimate, credible, and humble. But Keith, I'm going to tell you, we must have listeners out there that said, that is wonderful, but as a leader, I just don't have time. I got things on my plate. I have things to get done. I'm valued as a manager or leader for drawing the hard line, not mixing, emotions with accomplishments. And so therefore, I just don't have time for a lot of this stuff in a fast-paced environment that I live in. Help those managers out there recognize, or at least help us recognize, truly the importance of taking the time to really focus, if you will, on creating more of, I've heard that phrase, secure base.
Yeah, well, that's the key. You want to, again, it goes back to what we said earlier. Leadership is all about relationships. And so it's creating relationships with your direct reports, your peers, your boss, the customer, everyone. So without it, that's a real problem. That's going to be a real challenge.
So when I use the word secure base, I'm talking about really employees feeling much safer and more comfortable, as you've shared as well, about coming and talking to their leaders about things that are on their mind and things that they want to open up about. Back to those wonderful behaviors again, really quickly hit on some of those characteristics or behaviors that would be included when creating that secure base.
You want to focus on the person's potential, their strengths, what they do well. You want to encourage risk-taking, for example, within the team, the organization. You want to build on the intrinsic motivation of the individual as opposed to the extrinsic. You want to remain the calm adult we talked about before, and listen and explore versus to tell. These are some of the critical behaviors.
All right. The bottom line, as I'm taking a lot of this away, Dr. Keith, is that it's very important to build that trusting relationship. So before we close out the podcast focused on leadership resiliency, give us one last tip that you really think our listeners should be remembering.
Good question. I think it's really important to understand that people don't care how much you know until they know you care about them.
Oh, it's a difficult thing to be able to oftentimes work towards and be able to master, but you got to get back to the doing. You got to get past the doing and sometimes focus on the individual, and the rest takes care of itself. So we hope you've enjoyed yet another edition of the Resiliency X Factor, or as we simply call it, RX, your prescription for success in business. Dr. Keith, thank you again for giving us additional insight into what it takes to be a resilient leader, and we look forward to catching up with you at the next coffee break.